So I should
Starting, we are now
should
live.
not share screen, right? How do I get back to whole? How do I not, just close up at the top?
What are you trying to do?
I was trying not to share the screen yet and just be part of the little grouping of us at the top. Because who can the audience see? Just me at this point?
Anybody who's got any of us who have our cameras on, they'll be able to see the whole time.
Okay.
When you start sharing screen, it'll show who's
Up to
talking.
50
Right.
participants. People are coming in.
Okay.
Okay, cool. We gotta let them in.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started in just a few moments, waiting for all those participants and attendees to start coming in. We'll wait just a few more minutes. I still see some people coming in. All right, a few more moments. All right, so we are about 3 minutes in, so I think we'll go ahead and get started with our intro so that we have enough time for our presentation and for the questions at the end. Hi everybody, thank you for joining us. My name is Justine. I'm a museum educator here at the San Diego History Center, and I want to thank you all for joining us today for our latest presentation in our SD 101, the History of Our Region webinar series. The History Center also wants to extend a very special thank you to our members for all of your support. We couldn't do this without your help. Before we begin our presentation, there's a few things to remember. Our speaker will answer questions as best as she can at the end of the presentation. So if you can hold on to those questions, if you want to get them in the Q&A box, that should be at the bottom of your screen. That's the best way to do it. So please use that Q&A function. And like all of our presentations, this presentation will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. If you have not seen the previous presentations, those should be up there on our YouTube channel as well. And we will put links to the YouTube channel in the chat box. So we'll go ahead and get started. So our presenter today is one of the History Center's community historians, Linda Canada. Linda has been giving talks for the San Diego History Center for over more than 20 years. She has also served as the archivist for the Japanese American Historical Society of San Diego from 2005 to 2017 and was its president from 2009 to 2012. So without further ado, Linda, the camera is yours.
Okay, great. Welcome everybody, and I'm glad you're here with me today. I'm happy to give you a little talk about San Diego during World War I, and because that was such a darn long time ago, and maybe we don't even have grandparents or great grandparents who participated in that time period, I'm going to give you just a real short history. But my goal is to not bore you with the details of the war itself, but really to let you know what life was like here in San Diego during World War I, because things were very different. So let's go. Okay, so let us move straight ahead here into the slideshow. And this is just a very short timeline of the details of the war. What I want you to notice is that the war actually started in 1914. But if you go almost all the way down the timeline, you will see that the United States did not get involved until 1917. So there was a whole lot of things going on in Europe. Germany was at war with a number of countries. England declared war on Germany. And Americans were very non-committal about getting involved. However, here in San Diego, there was a huge parade for San Diego called a Sacred Peace Day Parade, where we had about 600 members of the Marine Corps who were here, marching in the parade with their rifles reversed. So, non-combatant rifles reversed, and 2,000 people here in San Diego. Now, mind you, we had a population of less than 70,000 at this point. So that was a lot of people to be marching in opposition to what was happening in Europe, but we were not involved. And we continued to not be involved through 1914, 15, 16. Many people know about the sinking of the Lusitania by the Germans. That was not a trigger to us getting in, but it certainly angered everybody. And it made people aware that the Germans had what were called U-boats, or submarines, we call them today. And they were starting to sink supply ships and ships of neutral nations. But what really got us involved in the war was the leaking by the British of a telegram that they had intercepted between a German war minister, Zimmermann, and the leadership in the government of Mexico. And what Germany was offering is, if Mexico would become involved in the war on the side of the Germans, when the Germans won the war, the Germans would then undo the Mexican-American War with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So states or areas that comprise California, Arizona, Nevada, parts of Utah, parts of Wyoming, Colorado, all of that area would revert to the ownership of Mexico. That was a huge, huge thing here in the United States. And that is what triggered our involvement in the war. So President Wilson moved forward with a declaration of war in the Congress. And April 6th, we were at war with Germany. It was estimated by the government and by the military that there would need about 1 million troops to be trained and to go over to help fight the war with the Allies. And Wilson assumed that people were just going to volunteer, that men would just trip all over themselves volunteering to go into the military. And that's not what happened. And at the end of about 6 weeks, there were only 73,000 men who had volunteered. And so they implemented a draft. There were 3 different drafts that took place during the course of the war. And something different, and again, there are many things that are different about World War I, but one thing that was different about the draft during World War I, unlike all previous drafts by the United States, men could not offer up a substitute to serve in their place. So if you were drafted, you had to go. So that was a really big difference. So US declares war on Germany, and almost immediately we start construction of Camp Kearney here in San Diego. Trainees start to arrive, they go off to fight in France, and we were only in the war for about 18 months before the war ended in 1918. So we had a very small part in this war, but it was very significant for our history here in San Diego. Let's go. Here's sleepy little San Diego. You can see in the left picture, this is about 1911, 1912. You can see there's not much activity in the harbor front here. There are no wharfs except for the one Spreckles Wharf where most of the ships came in and got their coal. There was no military presence over in Coronado at all. So we're just this sleepy little town. And we started to wake up as the plans were coming together for the big exposition that was going to be held up in Balboa Park. But mind you, we're planning for this great big party, this wonderful scene that would welcome tourists and visitors to San Diego for the purpose of them knowing what a wonderful community we were, and hoping to get them to come here and buy land and move here and start businesses. And at the same time that's happening, the war is going on in Europe. But we kind of managed to put it out of our minds, and we have this big exposition here in San Diego. But at the same time, we were kind of growing as a city. So this is what the city streets, today we would call this kind of the gas lamp quarter. You are looking, this is the intersection of 4th Street and E Street. So you are looking up E Street toward Golden Hill. The photographer is sort of standing in the street right outside to what is today the restored Balboa Theater that's at the edge of Horton Plaza. So that's where this location was. And you can see here in the early 19-teens, we did not have motorized vehicles to speak of. There's one way back here up on maybe the crossing with 6th Avenue, but almost everything is horse-drawn. So that's for carrying people, that's for carrying materials. The streets were not paved, and although there were streetcar lines on 4th and on 5th, it was, you got around by doing a lot of walking, actually, in this downtown area. This was the center of San Diego. Now, there was a lot of social activism going on in San Diego, even though we were not opposed to the war in any great way, at least not enough to push Washington to get involved. There were a lot of social justice things going on. Women were pushing for the right to vote and did get it in California in 1911, even though the rest of the country didn't have it till 1920. In 1911, we got the right to vote. 1912, we had a big Labor Day parade where women were fighting for equal pay for equal work. There was a lot of activity among the women's clubs in support of things like cleaning up the sidewalk, getting rid of that manure on the streets so that the children could be healthy and walk to their schools. There was a lot of activity about taking care of the poor, finding housing for those who didn't have it. So a lot of social justice type things going on in San Diego. But also some military things were happening at this time, even though it was quite a while until we were going to be involved in the war. In 1911, a man named Glenn Curtis arrived in San Diego. He was an aircraft inventor. In fact, he was in competition with the Wright brothers and existed at about the same time. The reason he came to San Diego was as he was inventing new types of aircraft and attempting to patent his changes, the Wright brothers were filing suit against him at every option. Everything that he did, they claimed that their patent covered it. And so he was just sick and tired of fighting with them. So he came to San Diego with the idea of starting a flight school. So he leased some land over on Coronado that the Spreckels interests owned. And he started a flight school over there. And he had civilians who wanted to learn how to fly. And eventually the Navy and the Army both became interested in learning how to fly as well. But really what he was doing was developing new planes. So he was continuing his inventing. And one of the most significant things that he developed while he was here in San Diego was called by the long name hydro aeroplane, but it was simply a seaplane, and it had a float down at the bottom so that it could land on the water. And in the case of the early ones, they had to be winched back up to the deck of the ship from which they could be launched. And once they figured out how to do that easily, then the military got very involved because this was a whole new way of warfare for them, flying in planes. Well, he had these students at his flying school, and the newspaper reported on the second graduating class. There were exactly 11 planes, and those planes flew, their graduation flight was from San Diego to Los Angeles at an airspeed of 85 miles an hour. They stayed overnight, and then they flew back to San Diego. And the newspaper called this the largest flotilla of aircraft ever in the United States. So that's how much we were at the very beginning of aviation here and taking part in San Diego. Now, by 1916, Glenn Curtis's planes were in demand by the English and the French. And so he moved back out of San Diego and started a production facility in my hometown of Buffalo, New York. And those planes were then shipped over to Europe. And they were the only American-made planes that were flown during World War I. And where was the flying school? Way down here on the very tip of Coronado Island. But that made it very convenient for him because he had all of this open water in San Diego Bay that he could be maneuvering those hydro aeroplanes and figuring out how to land and take off from the water. The people in San Diego were very interested in what he was doing. And in fact, here on the other side of the bay, cars would often line up along the bay here to watch the activities in the flying school. And if something really good happened, they all honked their horns and flashed their lights, and it was a really big deal. Well, we had another military base here at the time Glenn Curtis was here with the Army and the Navy on Coronado. Fort Rosecrans had been established in 1898 over on Point Loma. So we had the cavalry, you know, horses were the means of locomotion in those days. So they lived at the edge of San Diego Bay and guarded the entrance to the harbor. Now, when the exposition opened, then the Department of the Navy encouraged the leaders of the exposition to allow for an exhibition camp to be set up during the fair. And so the Marine Corps was settled down. They were living in Balboa Park in these tents and giving parades, the Navy was here at the same time, so the Navy was giving parades. Men were learning to row boats and control boats in the Lily Pond outside the Botanical Building. And in the bottom picture on the right, you can see this is the Park Boulevard side of the park, except there was no road through then. It was simply a trolley line that came up from downtown. But here on either side of the trolley line are tents from the military that was living here and practicing in Balboa Park. Now, the Marine Corps left the park, went off to fight some other battles, and when they came back to a new Marine Corps recruit depot here in San Diego. The Navy stayed in town and was on Coronado and other places around San Diego. So we did have military in San Diego, but not nearly to the extent of when war was declared, because that's when the same men who were the business leaders of our community, who had managed to get the exposition buildings built and the fair opened, these same men convinced the government very quickly that San Diego had plenty of land and plenty of willingness to open a training camp here in San Diego. And so Camp Kearney was established. It was across the San Diego River. It was in the neighborhood of Scripps Ranch, today's Scripps Ranch. And today, part of that land is the home to the Marine Corps Air Station Miramar. It was a naval station when I came here. Anyway, so Miramar is now located on part of this land, but something you should think about in terms of the size of Camp Kearney. It was 6 times the amount of acreage as the acreage in today's Miramar Marine Corps Air Station, 6 times. So it was a huge encampment. It was designed so that 40,000 men and 20,000 horses could live and train there as they were getting ready to go to war. It was a massive undertaking because this empty land, these open mesas on the north side of the San Diego River, roughly where Highway 52 cuts across from east to west today, it needed to be cleared of the brush. It needed to be graded. They needed to put in water lines, sewer lines, electrical lines, and then they had to build housing for the 40,000 men who were expected to come and live and train there. So how did you do that? Well, they ordered redwood from Mendocino up in Northern California, which was shipped down here to San Diego, 7 million board feet just to do the first part of the encampment where the men were going to live. So they started bringing this in by ship, milling it down around the bay and the lumber yards, putting it on a railroad. There were special railroad spur lines that had to be built into the encampment at Camp Kearney in order to get the wood to the places where the buildings would be built. Now, this was never intended to be a permanent Army base. It was what was called a cantonment, or a temporary base. So what the soldiers slept in and on was a flat redwood base that sat on the ground, a little raised so that no bugs and animals could get inside, but a flat base. And then there were wood walls up about waist height, and then finally a tent up at the top. So that was where the men slept. And there were about 700 of these individual buildings. Now, you don't just have to build the buildings where they sleep. You have to build the restrooms. You have to build the mess halls. They had enough mess halls built at Camp Kearney that 5,000 men could be served food at the same time in total of all those locations. So it was a huge undertaking. And for the most part, the work was completed in 11 weeks. So we went to war in April, and by July, it was ready for men to start coming. They continued building, however, and the next important part of the camp to be built was the hospital area, which took even more lumber than the lumber that was required for the first phase, because the hospital buildings were designed as permanent buildings. So you had housing for men, you had training grounds for men. They built false trenches. They built fake tanks, because tanks were just at the very beginning of their use in warfare. Remember, this is a time when the men who came into the army at this point expected that they would be working with horses, not with motor vehicles, not with motorized tanks. So it was a completely technologically different war, and something everybody kind of had to get used to. Well, so the first recruits were actually men who were actually still had been admitted to the service through the National Guard. So there were 5,000 men in National Guard units throughout the West: California, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado. And Colorado is important because they brought with them a mascot from Colorado. They brought a live black bear as their mascot, and it lived with the men at the encampment. There were other mascots in camp. There were dogs, there were cats, but that black bear kind of caught everybody's eye. Now, the first division that was here that would train the first from July and then finally leaving in August of the following year, they were known as the Sunshine Division. They were the 40th Division of the Army. Sunshine because of the weather here in San Diego. Everybody was so impressed with what they had when they got here. So in the lower image on this page, you can see the men and the encampments, and they were just spread out across this huge piece of land. Now, what do you do when you incorporate a lot of men, many of them single, and you require them to live here 24 hours a day on this completely barren stretch of land? Well, you've got to do something. You've got to build some places for them, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But let me talk about who are the people who come as volunteers or as draftees. So on the upper left-hand side is a registration card from a man who lived in Lemon Grove, a man named Edwin Zonka. His family owned a sort of a general store with a post office in Lemon Grove. And he was one of the first volunteers here in the San Diego region. He volunteered May 25th. So even before they had the first draft in June, he was already in the military. The only problem was there was no base for him to serve at because Camp Kearney would not be completed for another few months. So he kind of drifted around. There were some, the newspaper reported on there being some congratulatory parties given in his honor because he had volunteered for the military. Finally, he was shipped off to bases which were ready to handle him for training, but he never seemed to get orders to go over to the war. He served in Texas for a while. He was trained as a chauffeur. He was an enlisted person, so he would be able to drive the officers around, probably because of his family's business here in Lemon Grove. He drove trucks and other vehicles, and so that might have been a natural kind of role for him. But he really did not get over to Europe until about November of 1917, even after he had volunteered in May. So it was a long time that took him to move on. The other man to talk about here, these medals are from his time He was a Japanese national who came to the United States and volunteered for the US Navy before the war, at a time when Japanese and other non-whites were only allowed to serve as stewards, as cabin cleaners. They served very menial jobs. And so Donichi Kawasaki was a commissary steward. He served on a number of Navy ships. And finally, he was on board the USS San Diego, which was sunk on the East Coast, but he survived the sinking and went to New York and soon was assigned to another ship. And so he actually served in the Navy until about 1920, when the war was well over. One of the benefits he received from serving in the war for all this time, which was available to all men who were not American citizens, they were offered naturalized American citizenship in return for their service in the war. So Donichi Kawasaki became a naturalized American citizen. His family had businesses on Fifth Avenue in what is today's Gaslamp Quarter. So he's somebody to know about who served in the war during that time period. Now, what's going on where all these men are coming to San Diego for training, and they're massing up at Camp Kearney, and they're spending all their time marching and fighting in faux trenches and learning to handle horses and learning to deal with tanks? Well, the people at home were having to deal with some shortages that were made so that the military would have food and the materials that it would need. And so this is a poem courtesy of Professor Molly McLean, who found it in notes of Ellen Browning's scripts materials. This was going around between the women in San Diego. It's kind of cute. My Tuesdays are meatless, my Wednesdays are wheatless, I'm growing more eatless each day. My house, it is heatless, my beds are all sheetless, all gone to the YMCA. The bar rooms are treatless, my coffee is sweetless. Each day I grow poorer and wiser. My stockings are feetless, my trousers are seatless. My God, how I do hate the Kaiser. So all of these deprivations that people were suffering here in San Diego in order that the troops could have the materials that they needed. Now, the women's clubs in particular were very active during this time period. The Wednesday Club had been founded in the 1890s, and they completed their building in 1911, right outside 6th Avenue, 6th and Ivy, and outside Balboa Park. The La Jolla Women's Club, active about the same time. Their building was built in 1912 in La Jolla, using a tilt-up concrete style of construction that was popularized by Irving Gill here in San Diego. Their building was financed by this woman right here, Ellen Browning Scripps, who lived in La Jolla and was very active in supporting things that benefited the military here in San Diego. Another group that was very active, these are the members of the Jolly 16. It was a Jewish women's organization. The Jewish community was very active in that Sacred Peace Day that opposed the war in 1914. And then they became very active in making sure that Jewish members of the Army, enlistees in the Army at Camp Kearney, had places that they could go, ways that they could celebrate holidays. And in fact, the Jewish percentage of men serving in the Army was greater than the percentage of Jews in the general population here in the United States. So the Jews did volunteer a great deal. Now, all around San Diego, there were all kinds of organizations, church groups, women's clubs, students in the schools. At San Diego High School, the graduating class of 1917 decided to dedicate their school annual, their yearbook, to defeat of the Kaiser Bill. They didn't like him much at all. They raised money to give to the Red Cross so that the Red Cross could purchase sweaters and socks and other things that were needed by the men in the military. Other service clubs, many of them went in for knitting. In fact, it got to the point where it was hard to find yarn here in San Diego because so many people were knitting for the men overseas. And something I kind of like to smile about, the Wednesday Club was one of the sponsors of a February event called the Charity Ball. And the Charity Ball was an upper class women's big, very formal party, men in tuxedos, women in formal gowns, held on an annual basis, still is held to this day. And the Charity Ball in 1918, February 1918, the walls of the building, it was held at the Hotel Del over in Coronado. The walls were covered with the huge flags of the member nations of the allies that the US was fighting with. There were members of the officer corps of French and English who were cooperating with the training of the troops at Camp Kearney. So they came and they were special guests, and a big deal was made of them. But the part that I love about trying to envision these women in their high hairdos and their ribbons and their jewels and their formal gowns is they also brought their knitting bags, and they were knitting socks and scarves during the Charity Ball. So knitting, rolling bandages was another thing that women got together to do. And so you had all kinds of drives of different types of organizations and entities that wanted to help support the troops. Some of the businesses downtown, for example, some of the hotels which were downtown, converted some of their public rooms into reading rooms and rest facilities and places where men who were on leave could come over and just spend some time in a more quiet and urbane setting while they were in town and on their leave. Book drives happened because Andrew Carnegie, who had financed libraries across the United States, was requested by members of the Wednesday Club here to build a library out at Camp Kearney, and he did. So he spent about $320,000 to build a library for the troops at Camp Kearney. And the deal was that the community would provide the books, the government would pay for the heat, the light, the basic services for the library, and then Carnegie provided the library building itself. In order to get that library up and running, the services were requested by the secretarial and stenography students at the Kelsey Jennings Secretarial School to come over and type the library index cards so that the troops who came in to use the books would be able to check out books and would be able to see what was in the library. The hostess homes at Camp Kearney were very important to women who were visiting their brothers or fathers or loved ones who were serving there at Camp Kearney. This is the time period when women are still wearing corsets and very long dresses. It was difficult for them to handle their sanitary needs. And so women's hostess homes were a place where women had large, spacious, modern for the time bathrooms where they could take care of their needs. Also, these hostess homes were designed so that they were safe places where women could go in and meet with their men friends, for example, and not have their reputations ruined by hanging out with a single man. So they were monitored by women. The women in the lower right-hand corner here are in the dress that was appropriate for the hostess home. So it was sort of a quasi-military thing on camp there. And the first one of these YWCA hostess homes was designed and built by a woman named Julia Morgan, a female architect who later designed Hearst Castle up in Northern California. It was paid for by Ellen Browning Scripps. It was furnished by and the interior designed by a woman named Alice Klauber, who was a well-known artist and had designed a very well-known room at the exposition in Balboa Park. And The gardens outside the hostess homes were designed and planted by none other than our dear Kate Sessions. So this was a real community activity. We had this huge base. You could take a bus up there to visit people, and they had visiting days on Sundays and on 2 afternoons during the week, so that the men who were not involved in training would be able to meet with relatives. So that was part of what went on to try and keep the men active. So they had libraries, and they had let's see if I can get to the next slide here. There we go. They had entertainment activities. And so they had films that were available. They had live theater as well. They had opera. They had orchestral works. They had movie stars visit. The woman in the center here is a woman named Mary Pickford, who was very popular at the time. And you can see they're standing on one of those redwood bases with the sides built up so that they would have a tent overhead. And so this was the kind of building in which the men slept on cots as they were in their training there. So not only did the film stars come to make appearances and entertain the troops, but also actual films were made on the grounds of the training camp. So there was always something, somebody new and interesting to keep the attention of the men. Something that they started in October of 2017 was they decided to have an inter-service sports day. And so they were allowed to use the Balboa Stadium, which was a huge stadium located down sort of close to where San Diego City College is today, just below Balboa Park. They were allowed to use that. And so the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Army put together teams, and they were very pleased that 150 people showed up to watch them play. They repeated this activity in February, just 4 months later, and 10,000 people came to watch the competitions. So this was a big deal, a real way of entertaining the troops, making the connection between the troops who were here and the people who were helping to support them, giving up food and clothing and other things in order that the troops could be ready to go. And when were they ready to go? Well, they didn't stop training until August of 1918. They had to make it all the way across the country. They had to, and that was done primarily by trains. Then they had to make it across the Atlantic, which was being prowled by the U-boats, the German submarines. They went to England, then they had to make the crossing across to France. So it was a pretty long and involved trip for the soldiers to make it over to the actual battlegrounds in Europe, in France, in Germany. But they eventually did. San Diegans did end up in the trenches and fighting the fight overseas. However, it wasn't long before the war was over. And by November 11th, the war had been declared over. And so even though there were another 12,000 men who had come to Camp Kearney to begin the next phase of training so that the next wave of American soldiers could go over, that training almost immediately stopped. All construction stopped. And so it was the end really of the active part of Camp Kearney for training soldiers. Now, a song that was issued in April of 1918 remembers the fact, remember the black bear that was a pet brought by the soldiers, the National Guardsmen from Colorado. Well, this song became very popular among the 40th Division. Pardon me, the 40th Division. We're coming back to California. Now, mind you, at the time this came out, they hadn't left yet. They didn't leave till August, but the song was here, the music was available. And so this was just one of many things that remain behind of the time when San Diego was involved in World War I. So what happened toward the end of the period when Camp Kearney was active and actively training? Well, don't forget that 1918 and 1919 was the time when influenza had been brought to our country, was crossing the country, and it was particularly virulent in military bases. And so we were not spared here in San Diego, although the extent of the contagion and the damages were not as bad as other places in the country. One byproduct of having the influenza epidemic, however, was that when the Jewish community put together funds to build a dedicated home for what was known as the Jewish Welfare Board. This was about the same size as the other YWCA houses, YMCA houses, and other organizations at Camp Kearney. However, it was built and it was never able to be occupied because of the influenza epidemic. So it sat there. They had this dedication ceremony, but nobody was allowed to go inside. And it sat there through the end of 1919. And finally in 1920, the camp was declared finished in terms of recruiting and training soldiers. And so the Jewish community was allowed to cut this building in half, haul it on flatbed trucks, and take it to a lot that was next door to their Beth Israel Synagogue, located at that time at 2nd and Beach Streets up in, I guess you would call it the Golden Hill area. So this building built on at Camp Kearney, but never occupied as such. Now, when you have a camp that has been demobilized, you have to do something with all of the buildings and all the materials that were there. And so the word went out that one could, if one had the ability to transport the materials, that one could kind of go up and cherry pick the redwood in particular, because it's a very durable wood and it was quite valuable. And so redwood from Camp Kearney gradually made its way down into neighborhoods of San Diego. And so the images on the upper part of this slide are two houses that were made out of redwood that was recycled out of Camp Kearney. They are in the area of North Park, just south of University Avenue. And the one on the left, you'll notice, has a San Diego Historic Resources Board plaque on the outside of it. I believe it is the only house to date that has actually been designated as a historic site due to the verified presence of Camp Kearney lumber having been used to build it. But I will say that this area of San Diego was being developed in the 1920s, and it is highly likely that there are many houses in the area that benefited from having some of that Camp Kearney lumber made available. Now, what was the US role in this war? Well, minuscule. This pie chart shows the casualties of all combatants in World War I. You notice the area in red. We only had 116 die out of the millions who died during World War I. So we had a fairly small role in it. But the war itself had a significant impact on San Diego. And so after the war was over, Camp Kearney was turned into a demobilization center. It was where men who were recovering from wounds that they suffered during the war, went through rehab, learned new trades to accommodate whatever their physical disabilities might be. So it was all closed up by about 1922. Here in San Diego, there was an area down here by National City where first a construction company put together a plan to build concrete-hulled ships that were supposed to be carrying fuel oil during the war. However, the war ended before these ships could be completed. So it was 1920 before the first of the only two were launched here from San Diego. So that site became part of the Navy destroyer base at 32nd Street. This is an image from about 1920, and you can see all of the decommissioned naval vessels this was basically a destroyer graveyard. They were decommissioned, and I suspect that several of them were probably recommissioned maybe 30 years later or 20 years later when the Second World War began. But for a long time, this is what you saw when you were down in this area of National City. So these are two of the World War I relics of San Diego's involvement in World War I. Gunpowder Point, where the ships were built, the naval destroyer base, and the words itself, Kearney Villa Road, Kearney Mesa, those names derive from the location of Camp Kearney up in that great open space north of today's Route 52. So those names live on here in San Diego. So that is the end of my show, and what I would like to do, I see if I can show my picture here. Nope. Okay, Katie or Justine, if you can help me show myself, that would be nice. I think I can. All right, there I am. There we am. Okay, I can deal with that. Okay, so if there are questions, I would be happy to answer questions about San Diego's changes and role in World War I.
All right, so let me find the Q&A function here. And I think a little bit might have been answered on your presentation, but I'll ask anyway. So one question was, the Panama Canal was opened about the same time as World War I, started in Europe, and how did the timing affect San Diego?
Wow, the Panama Canal was actually opening a little bit earlier, 1908, 1909, and it was the impetus for the creation of the exposition in Balboa Park, because the local businessmen wanted to take advantage of the easier availability of travel to the West Coast, and specifically San Diego. So, so the Panama Canal definitely influenced San Diego's growth as a center for tourism and their attempts to have more people move here and buy land and develop land. World War I, on the other hand, ships were able to traverse the canal, but you have to remember that almost all of the fighting was in Europe. So it wasn't something that was, ships could go from this coast through the canal to get over to Europe, but there wasn't a lot of back and forth like there would have been in the Second World War, when there were two different fronts that the war was being fought on.
Awesome, thank you. The next question says, to verify, is Camp Kearney Mission Trails Regional Park, or is that the Mesa of Mesa College County Administration Building DMV region? Sorry, is Camp Kearney Mission Trails Region, or I think she's asking about,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so the site of Camp Kearney really was where the Miramar Air Station is today. So that's where Camp Kearney was. Camp Kearney extended as far north as Miramar Road. And in fact, the hospital that I talked about being there, where the men went through rehabilitation and relearning skills and things, was very close to Miramar Road. And that's where the railroad spurs came off of the train line that makes a big loop up around the base there. Those railroad spurs came off there as well.
Awesome.
So has nothing to do with Mission Trails Park. Mission Trails Park is well to the east of this location, and this location was flat.
And then we have a comment saying, a few clothing buttons may have averted World War I. Archduke Ferdinand preferred to be sewn into his uniforms. When he was shot, he bled to death because his aides could not remove his coat fast enough to take care of his wounds. So just a comment on that. A fun comment, just a comment.
We've got a few related to the non-military population here in San Diego. So a little bit about wondering how World War II was for people who were not in the military, and how did the, what did I say? World War I is what I meant. How did the population change as the war ended?
I think that's a really good question that maybe I do another talk that's called Between the Wars, that I actually talk in depth about what happened after the end of the war and how people changed. But basically, the not as many people stayed in San Diego as did following World War II. There was a depression after the end of the war. There were not the jobs that people had hoped to find if they were going to move out here to San Diego. And so not a lot of people stayed here after the end of World War I. And what was the rest of that question, Sam?
What was life like for non-military citizens in San Diego?
For the non-military citizens in San Diego, they were, because of the huge numbers of soldiers, sailors, and members of the Marine Corps on the streets and participating in activities, having been encouraged by the business people downtown. One of the selling points of having the base out where it was that the soldiers would have nothing to spend their pay on until they took the buses down to San Diego and then could spend their money at the businesses that were in the downtown area. And so people were happy to see that it wasn't a Vietnam type thing. It was they were happy to see these people who were, preserving democracy and saving people. And so there were all kinds of activities going on. When the holidays came, people would invite soldiers into their homes to share meals. That was particularly true in various religious communities where there were specific services that would go on. But also, there were just generally community picnics that were held. There was a community picnic held up in La Jolla, for example, and people just brought food, and they brought flowers, and they brought things to make the soldiers happy. And then there were the celebratory parade after the declaration that the war was over. People walked from Camp Kearney all the way down across Miramar Road, down La Jolla Village Drive, down into La Jolla, and 3,000 to 4,000, 5,000 of them were around the Civic Center area where the little tennis courts are and the pool, little small pool area is. And they actually hung the Kaiser in effigy and burned him at the end of the war. I mean, they're pretty happy the war was over, but everybody was pretty darn happy and, happy to support the troops and their role in ending it.
Thank you. A couple other questions here about just sort of why folks were trained so far away from World War I as a European war. Why were troops trained so far away here in San Diego?
That's a very, very interesting question. And I suspect that a great deal of it has to do with the incentives that were offered by local business people. It was the same people like Wangenheim and I think, I'm not sure, well, at any rate, people who were involved with the planning of the exposition were also involved with negotiating to have that base out here because they saw that there were real benefits to the businesses in San Diego. And so I think that they gave up a lot in order to get the training base here. And the military bought into it. Now, don't forget that the military, it includes the Navy, and the Navy had already been coerced by Kettner to start coming to San Diego. And so there was already sort of this good feel about San Diego because so many concessions had been made by the locality in giving the Navy space here in San Diego. So when the Army wanted to come, there was sort of, I'm sure it was like, oh, okay, let's see what they're going to give us. Oh, you're muted, Sam.
Sorry. A question here about the treatment of the German community here in San Diego. Was there significant discrimination of the German community here in San Diego at the time?
I have not studied that specifically, but I have a personal connection to that. And that is that my family, my great grandfather considered himself a German, but his son, my grandfather, said, oh no, we're French. And the reason for that is they were from the area of Germany called Alsace-Lorraine, which was fought over time and time again between the Germans and the French. And it was not at all fashionable to be a German during the war years. And so the family very much claimed French. And so although the spelling of their name is Hébert, a French name, E-B-E-R-T, they pronounced it Ebert. And so, you know, it's just, yeah. So I know that Madame Schumann Heinke, an opera singer who is very much revered here in San Diego, had sons who fought on both sides of the war. And so she was respected as an artist. And I'm sure there were eyebrows raised when she had a son who was fighting for the German army.
Wow. Wow, that's an interesting topic that we could probably talk about for even longer. There was a question about one of the specific photos in your presentation, the
Yes.
picture of Coronado with the
Yes.
Curtis Flight School. Is that a bridge going from San Diego to Coronado?
There is no bridge going. What you were seeing was a bridge that was going from the South Island of Coronado to the North Island of Coronado. In order for the soldiers and sailors and Marines who were assigned there to get to their workspace at the north part of the island where the air school was, they had to take a ferry across from the city of San Diego, land on the South Island of Coronado, and then go across that bridge in order to get to their duty stations. And things got a little nasty at times because the different services took turns being the sentries in charge of crossing the bridge. And so sometimes the Army guys wouldn't let the Navy guys across and say, oh, I don't know, your papers aren't quite right here. And, you know, I don't know, and make them late for work. And, you know, it's just it's kind of going back and forth like that. And it was finally the Department of the Navy complained and said, you know what? We are the Navy. We need the water. We don't need to have the Army on this island, and we don't need to have the Marine Corps on this island. And it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who at the time was the Secretary of the Navy, who said, you know what? The Navy needs to be on the water, and you two other services find someplace else to go.
Thank you. And then a question about how Kearney was pronounced then and now. Can you speak to that?
I have no information about that at all. I know that there are people who pronounce it differently, and I don't know. Initially, it was spelled differently as well, and but
variation, change over time.
There you go. Yeah, but there's no E in the end. It's Kearney, K-E-R-N-Y.
And then a couple questions here about the influenza pandemic. So one thought originating perhaps in a stateside military base and not necessarily in Europe. That's some recent research, I think. And any comparisons we can make between the flu epidemic in 1918 and current pandemics here. And to that same kind of point is how the Spanish flu affected the military here in San Diego specifically. You touched on it a little bit, but I think they're wondering more.
Yeah, there's a little bit more. They did note that the influenza, what they called the Spanish flu at that time. Yeah, I'm trying to think of the story of why it was the Spanish flu. At any rate, the Spanish flu was more dangerous for young men and women than it was for the elderly. So unlike what we're dealing with today. And so the men and women men in the military were particularly prone to get it, and they were concerned for them. One of the many community activities that I talked about, rolling bandages and knitting socks, well, making masks became another big community activity for community groups because of the influenza epidemic. And like the epidemic we have had, it sort of had a couple of different waves. And so in September, it appeared, it looked like it was about over in October, and then they had a big flare up in November where they had to require everybody to just stay off the streets. wear masks at all times. And when the war was actually declared over on November 11th, they were still not able to go out and celebrate, but that didn't stop them.
We just got a message from John in the Q&A who brought up the one of the original questions here about Spain being neutral and the main source of international news reporting. So being kind of assigned the credit for the flu. So maybe that's part of the reason there.
Yeah.
They were the only ones reporting, in the Allied powers and the Axis powers, or that's not the Central powers, were censoring reports of it to begin with, is kind of what I understand was happening. So they were the only ones actually reporting on it, and they got the unfortunate moniker.
Yep, forever. And then I see one more question in the chat here about women nurses. So women in military or involvement with male troops here in San Diego.
Here in San Diego or overseas? It's a different. It's a different question. It is a different question.
There's no specification in the question, so maybe a little bit about both.
Okay, all right. So to my knowledge, there were not a lot of female nurses at the camp hospital up at Camp Kearney, to my knowledge, and I haven't done an extensive research on that, but from what I've read, I don't remember it being mentioned. There were more female nurses overseas because they had gone over as volunteers, and so they were more permitted, I guess is the only way I can think about it. They were not barred because of their gender from serving overseas. They may not have had the training, but they were certainly viewed as they could comfort and make the troops, happy, not happy. I'm not suggesting in a bad way. I'm just saying that they were females and they were gentle and they were, had these attributes that it was thought the men would do well with. There is a story which people may be interested in. There is a book written by a woman named Elizabeth Cobb, C-O-B-B, called The Hello Girls. And this is about a group of women here in the United States who were recruited to go overseas, and their requirement for being selected was that they had to be fluent in French, because their role when they went over to France was to serve as the telephone operators on the switchboards, which was the means by which the French generals and the English or American generals were coordinating their attacks on the Germans. And these telephones, don't forget, this is not cell phones, this is telephone wires, which were laid in the trenches, and these telephone switchboards were moved from location to location, and the women moved along with them. And so this Hello Girls book is a very interesting description of these women who were in the trenches during World War I.
Thank you. Yeah, I've looked into that a little bit, and it's fascinating. And then their treatment after the war as well is its own story as well. Mm-hmm. And we've got a comment in here from Bill Fish talking about Ancestry.com and the info available on Edwin Sanka that you mentioned, and mm-hmm. his success after the war, and that he died in Lemon Grove in 1966. So good long life there. So thanks, Bill, for sharing that information.
Yes.
And I think that's the last of our questions. If folks have any more, and you want to see, any of these topics that you've seen on SD 101 today or any others, our website is a great place to start. Our search bar is fantastic for finding our journal articles or past exhibitions, all sorts of information, full of lots of interesting facts and things to read and check out. So please do check that out. And if you aren't finding something, feel free to email us either at info@sandiegohistory.org or education@sandiegohistory.org. We'd be happy to point you in the right direction. And stay tuned for our future topics. San Diego 101 will be back next month. And I think we just dropped the link in the chat there, that Zoom link that you can see, that is to join us next time. So the second Tuesday of every month, we'll be doing this again. Linda will be back with us. And so please do join us and register for that. Oh, she dropped it in again. Good.
And Sam, let me mention, I will be wearing my other hat, and I will be speaking on behalf of Japanese American history here in San Diego during the May presentation.
Yes, so Linda will be joining us in a different capacity, but with her same fantastic presentation style and anecdotes to share with us about San Diego history. So please do join us. And also, please, we are so happy to be able to welcome you back to the History Center in person this weekend. We are opening on Friday the 16th at the San Diego History Center. We'll be open all weekend there at our site in Balboa Park. And the Sarah Museum in Presidio Park will be open Saturday and Sunday. Our hours at both locations are 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. And we are so excited to have you back in our spaces in person. We will be following all of our safety procedures and expectations for all guests and visitors. So please do wear your mask and keep your distance, but make sure that you say hello. And if you have any other thoughts or questions, please do send us an email or come and tell us in person, because we'll be able to see you this weekend. And thank you so much, Linda, and we'll see you next time. We're very excited to have you back, I think a couple more times for San Diego 101.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
thank
Thank
you
you very
all
much.
for joining us.
Thank you.